So now we know how to style our components. And again, we're definitely not done here. This is not the final look I want to have. But before we dig deeper into tweaking the final look and adding more UI elements, let's think about one maybe obvious problem. We will probably not just have one expense, and definitely not an expense where the data is just hard-coded into the component as it is here. The date is hard-coded here, the title is hard-coded, the amount is hard-coded, and it's the only expense we have. In our final tracker, we want to have an unlimited amount of expenses if we want to. We want to have multiple expense item components in action. And after all, that is one of the core ideas behind components. It's not just the separation of concerns, it's also the reusability. We want to define a component and its HTML code once, and then we want to be able to reuse it. And at the moment, we're not able to do that. Therefore, that will be the next problem we'll work on. But before we work on that, there's another problem which we have to solve first. And that's something I just mentioned, that all that data is hard-coded here in this JSX code. This is unrealistic. Some data may be hard-coded sometimes, but here for an expense item, something like the date and the title and the amount would typically be dynamic, which means it's not hard-coded in the HTML code. Instead, we receive that data from somewhere, for example, from the user who entered it into a form, and we then output it dynamically. Now, for the moment, we don't have the capabilities yet to receive it from the user, but we can fake dynamic data by at least adding more than just HTML code to this component. Because after all, we must not forget that a component in React is just a function. And that earlier I mentioned that components are the combination of HTML, to some extent CSS, and also JavaScript. Now we definitely see HTML in action. We also saw some CSS being added, but where's the JavaScript other than that being a function? Well, let's add some JavaScript code in that function before we return. For example, let's add a constant, so a variable which may never change, and in there let's store a date by using the built-in date constructor which comes with JavaScript. Let's give this constant a name, for example, expense date, sounds like a fitting name. And then let's maybe set an initial date value here, which is the year 2021, March as a month, and since the month field here starts at 0, March has the number 2, and then there, the 28th. This is how we can create such a date object, and this, and that's really important to me, is just regular JavaScript. Has nothing to do with React. And we can, and we typically do, have JavaScript code like this in our components. Here, just to create some dummy data. Later in the course and in your React applications, that could be any kind of code. For example, to send a HTTP request and fetch data from a database, to validate user input, or to do any other kind of task. So here we have our expense date. We can also have our expense title here, which is maybe car insurance. So a simple string stored in this constant. And then our expense amount, which is, let's say, a number, 294.67. So we have these three constants, regular JavaScript code, and we now want to output these values here in this HTML code. And that is a typical task. Typically, you don't have data hard-coded in HTML. Instead, to output dynamic data, you use a special syntax React gives you inside of these JSX code snippets. You can replace hard-coded data with opening and closing curly braces. Single curly braces, opening and closing. And the special thing about these curly braces inside of your JSX code snippets is that in these curly braces, between them, you can run basic JavaScript expressions. For example, 1 plus 1. You can execute something like this there, and it's now the result of this expression, which will be output on the screen. So if I run 1 plus 1 between curly braces here, we see 2. We can also do something like math random here and generate a random number with the built-in math object. And we see the number here. And every time I reload, I get a new number, of course. Now that's something we can do. Now here, I don't want to get a random number. I don't want to add 1 plus 1. Instead, I want to refer to the value stored in this constant. And therefore, we can just repeat that constant name here. This is also a valid JavaScript expression, just pointing at a variable or a constant, in this case a constant. And now JavaScript will extract the value stored in this constant and basically inject it here into this HTML code, so to say. So if I now save that, we again see car insurance here just like before, but now it's not hard-coded in the HTML code, but instead here it's output dynamically and the concrete value is taken from that constant. There, of course, it's still hard-coded, but it's just a first step. Now we can do the same for the amount. So here, after the $sign, which I will leave hard-coded for now, we can point at expense amount. And for the date, we can do something similar. Here, we can output expense date, though for the date, we have to keep in mind that it's a date object. And therefore, if we try to save it like this, it just breaks. Because this being a date object, it can't be output as text like this. However, we can call toISOstring, for example, a built-in method available on all date objects, to output it as a string, and now we see this at least. Not super readable, but a first step. Now we will refine and fine-tune the way this is being output later. For the moment, we just achieved one important thing. We now no longer work with hard-coded text in our HTML code, but instead we have these dynamic placeholders, you could say, where the concrete value can be the result of a calculation, of a HTTP request, or, as it is here at the moment, the value stored in a constant or variable. And now with that out of the way, we can move on and we can take a closer look at how we can make this expense item more reusable, so that it's not always the same data which we're outputting, and so that we can have multiple expense items based on one and the same component with different data.